Did you know that there were 17 countries in Africa that experienced coups since 2007? I bet you didn't know that. Did you know that there were 14 successful coups as well as failed attempts since 2007? Yeah, that's very significant, and that's something we're going to talk about today. Now, why 2007? Now, 2007 is significant because that is when the AFRICOM program was initiated by George Bush. And ever since that occurred in 2007, October of 2007 to be precise, there have been 17 countries that have experienced coups in Africa. You can almost argue that there has been coups in Africa every other year since 2007. 2008 coup, 2009, 2010, 12, 13, 15, 2020, 2021, 22, 23, and the recent attempt on Ibrahim Traore's life in 2025. All of this have been in mostly areas where AFRICOM is operating. We're going to have a good conversation about that. Before we do, I want you to take a look at this interview by General Michael Langley, where he's being grilled by Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz on the impact AFRICOM it's having in Africa. As a matter of fact, what I want you to pay attention in this interview is that Matt Gaetz is standing on the fact that AFRICOM is helping to train military soldiers who are committing coups in Africa. And so this is a very interesting conversation. Please take a look at this, and we'll have a good conversation about this.
General Langley, I have constituents that have been scattered across Africa on train and equip missions. So just ballpark, in the last decade, how many Africans has the United States military trained and equipped?
Congressman, I don't have that figure. I can get that figure for you.
Ballpark, just, how many?
Congressman, it would be a wild guess right now.
Seems like something we should know, right?
Over the years, we have trained a substantial number, especially in the Gulf of Guinea states, but including
like more than 10,000?
It is more than 10,000.
More than 50,000?
I'd say we're reaching around 50,000
okay.
at least.
And what percentage of the people we've trained end up participating in insurrections or coups against their own government?
Very small number, Congressman, very small number.
So what percentage do you think?
I'd say probably less than 1%.
Less than 1%, he says. When asked how many of those trainings in these African countries have resulted in insurrection or coups, he says less than 1%. Okay, let's take a look at that because that is false. So AFRICOM is currently present in 8 out of the 17 countries that experienced coups in the last 18 years. These countries are Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, Chad, Mauritania, the Gambia, and Egypt. 8 out of those 17 countries have all experienced coups. Now, 8 out of 17, that is not less than 1%. As a matter of fact, that is exactly 47% if you do the math on that. So I don't know where he's getting less than 1% from. So AFRICOM has been responsible for 47% of the coups that have occurred in Africa. That is staggering. I want you to also take a look at when he was grilled about the training and the individuals that are being trained through the AFRICOM program, who have then gone on to topple the government in those countries. Take a look at how he answers the question, how he dabbles. He struggles in this entire testimony, but take a look at how he answers this particular question.
Very small number, Congressman, very small number.
So what percentage do you think?
I'd say probably less than 1%.
But it does happen.
The IMET program is in force, and we've pushed a significant number through our schools across the
and what data sets do you track to arrive at the conclusion that less than 1% of the roughly 50,000 that we've trained have participated in coups? Because it'd be like about 500. about 1% of 50,000.
Congressman, you may have that information. I don't at this time, but I know.
Well, I know there are some, right? Like in, go ahead and throw up that image. This is Colonel Mamade Doumbouya, and this is a photo of him. Did we train and equip him? In Guinea?
By name, I cannot identify that.
Well, that guy in the middle with the big red hat, Colonel Mamade Doumbouya, that's him with a bunch of U.S. service members outside of our embassy. And just months after this photo was taken in 2021, he led a coup in Guinea and threw out the leader. Does that concern you?
Congressman, core values is what we start off with in IMA programs.
Do we share
stick to
core
that.
values with Colonel Doumbouya?
Core values. I will repeat that. Core values.
I know,
Respect for humanity.
Do we share those values with Colonel Doumbouya?
Absolutely. In our curriculum.
He led a coup?
We do.
Okay, well, that's a very telling answer. In Burkina Faso, did we share core values with the leader that we trained there who led a coup?
It's in our curriculum. We
Leading
stress
coups
core
are in our
values.
curriculum?
We request civilian-led governance.
Wait, hold on. Is leading coups in our curriculum?
So he was asked of the 1%, which he stated, of the so-called 50,000 military training that AFRICOM has provided in Africa since its inception in 2007. How was he able to track that number? He wasn't able to give a definitive response to that. And then he was asked and pressed on Mamadi Doumbouya, the military junta, who is currently right now occupying the presidency in Guinea. He was not able to provide an accurate response. So one can actually say that every place that U.S. has a base or so-called CSL, cooperative security locations in Africa, these places have actually had coups in the last 18 years. That is a staggering figure. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of is while you're watching Matt Gaetz press him on this, Matt Gaetz isn't on our side. Matt Gaetz is not looking out for Africa. He's not pressing Langley on the fact that why are we in Africa when our presence there is causing a coup? That is not the stance that Matt Gaetz is taking here. What Matt Gaetz is actually alluding to is that we are training people to topple the puppet leaders that we put in place. It is actually a concern for U.S. congressmen and U.S. Officials that these coups are occurring because when they put puppet leaders in these areas and then they are in there conducting so-called training, these trainings result to coups that then go on to overthrow the puppet leaders whom they put in there. So that is a direct effect of the AFRICOM program, which isn't aligned to U.S. interest in Africa. So that is the Matt Gaetz stance. So don't think of him drilling him, right, because he cares for Africa. No, they're very concerned that our presence there is counter-effective. We are there to provide the so-called training so we can spy and do an espionage in these countries. However, what we're seeing is that these trainings have now resulted to coups which have overthrown puppet leaders whom we put there to secure our interest in Africa. Okay, do you remember Dr. Celeste Wallander? Dr. Celeste Wallander, who is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Remember what she said about the AFRICOM program. Just in case you don't remember, I want you to take a look at what she said a couple of years ago and why that program is very important and essential for the survival of the United States. Take a listen to this.
On the AFRICOM AOR, Africa is not merely important, it is essential. African partnerships are critical for the Department of Defense to maintain its technological edge, accomplish its geopolitical and strategic objectives, and power our future.
Okay, so when you are piecing this whole thing together and you're trying to understand why AFRICOM is in Africa, for the life of me, I don't even know why Africa would entertain foreign bases in their countries. For the life of me, I don't understand that, right? But let's just put that aside and let's deal with the hypocrisy of the United States right? What they say AFRICOM program is there. What we've often heard is they're there to provide military training because they're so sophisticated and Africa has very poor military training. So they're there to help the indigenous out so they can fight terrorism and they can help to eliminate global terrorism. This is the official stance of AFRICOM. This is what you hear about them. But what we've often heard to contradict that on the lips of officials like the Assistant Secretary of International Affairs, Dr. Celeste Wallander, is that AFRICOM is not only providing a strategic partnership for the United States military defense, it is also for the survival of the United States in terms of mining rights, mineral resources, access to mineral resources in Africa. That is exactly why they're there. That is why 8 out of the 17 countries that have had coups in the last 18 years, where AFRICOM is located, has largely been because of the mineral resources in those countries. You see the contradiction here. You see the mouthpiece that they go around talking about the good deeds they're doing in Africa, while it is actually for the exploitation of those mineral resources. They want to have mineral rights. And so when you see China and Russia having an influence in Africa, in this area, especially the ones in the Francophone countries who had coups in the last 5 years, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, when you see the Sahel regions, Guinea, Chad, when you see those areas and the presence of China and Russia in those areas, it gives them a huge concern because they know that China has been expanding its presence in Africa, largely through the project that China has been embarked on or funding in Africa. But more importantly, they are now starting to see China wanting to have a military presence in Africa. So far, China doesn't have bases except the one in Djibouti in Africa. But that is probably going to change. And they are afraid of that China is quickly gaining access to mineral rights in Africa, which could fund their defense project in their country to make them even more large and formidable than the United States. So that is a fear that the United States has. It's a major concern because one of the big things that the United States boasts of is its military industrial complex. It is one of the biggest things the United States boasts of. I mean, U.S. nowadays cannot really boast of a lot of things. The economy is shrinking every year, but the one thing that they spend a lot of money on is the defense. Every year, every president adds to the defense contract, the defense budget, because they understand that if a country is able to protect itself militarily, and a country is able to defend its borders, or a country is able to show military strength, it sends a type of message, fear, to any adversaries or partners you were not the ones to mess with, right? So they understand that. And so what they're doing is under the guise of so-called fighting terrorism, they're planting these bases in Africa because they know Africa is weak and not able to defend themselves. So while they're there, they're gaining mineral rights under the guise of this so-called initiative, corrupting puppet leaders or placing puppet leaders in those positions. And so when you hear Matt Gaetz say, hey, hold on a second, and he's grilling Michael Langley and telling him, like, hold on, we are training people who are then causing coups in Africa. What he's echoing is that we are shooting ourselves in the foot because we're training people who then topple governments that we put in there so we can mooch off of those countries. Again, I'm going to ask a question. I don't know why, for the life of me, Africa would allow foreign bases on their soil. I don't get it. I don't get it. Now, that is a problem for Africa. I said in my last video that the biggest threat to Africa is AFRICOM. The biggest threat. Because what that essentially has done is brought the invaders to your country, right? You open the doors to your invaders who have now come in they're providing so-called training, which is not top-notch. They're stealing intelligence from your countries. They're able to go in and use their drones and test drones in your countries, which are then spying around your countries to find the vulnerable areas in your countries. Those drone testings have been a huge success for the United States because when they have eyes in the sky, they're able to then gather intelligence on groups in Africa who aren't getting along. They're able to gather intelligence on vulnerable areas in Africa, in certain borders, in bordering countries in Africa. They're able to gather those intelligence, take it back, and then construct a military defense operations, which then can then, if Africans get out of, in any African countries, get out of pocket, they can then use that information to silence them or cause some insurrection in their countries. Again, I don't know for the life of me why any government in Africa will sign up for that unless they are paid, which is actually what's going on. They were paid under the table by the United States, the CIA, who come in to sign this agreement like the one that was just signed in Algeria to plant a base. So Algeria is about to have a base. There's one that was recently signed in 2024 in Ivory Coast. They're going to plant a base in Ivory Coast. So AFRICOM wants to expand its footprint in a lot of African countries, mostly West Africa. And these puppet leaders are placed there for a reason, for especially these types of things. And so when these coups then occur as a result of the so-called training they're providing, it is essentially a problem for the United States because it is against their interests. So Langley is going around to figure out exactly how they solve this problem. So I'm going to say this and I'm going to close. Africans will need to realize that the leaders who have put us in the predicament that we're in aren't going to save us. The leaders who have sold Africa to the West and Europe, to foreigners who have then come in and destabilize our countries, our regions, increase poverty in our countries, those puppet leaders aren't going to save Africa. They're going to keep plunging Africa into the abyss. What's going to save Africa are the Africans who live in these African countries. The Africans who are in various African countries will need to stand up like we're seeing in various countries, push back through protests, push back through lending their voices and speaking up against these military bases in their countries. Another thing that Africans can do is boycott corporations who are directly benefited from this presence of military bases in Africa, corporations in the West and Europe. Boycott those companies and those products in your countries, because the reason why those companies are there and the reason why AFRICOM is there is to protect the interests of those companies in your country. So when you think about Nestle products, when you think about Johnson & Johnson, when you think about Starbucks and coffee beans, when you think about McDonald's, the corporation, when you think about those fast food chains, the reason why they are there is largely because of your resources. And when they extract those resources at pennies on the dollars, is largely because U.S. government are in those countries ensuring that their assets on ground are protected. So when Africans begin to boycott those companies in your country, it will hurt their pocket. You have essentially begun doing something that is significant. Because simply just having protests on the street is one, because you're essentially making your voice heard. However, when you take actions which hurts the pockets of these corporations who are the ones benefiting from the presence of AFRICOM there, that's really significant. So until Africans begin to do that, you're not going to see a withdrawal of these bases in your country, it's just going to be an expansion of that. So I think that would be a game changer for Africa to begin boycotting. And Africans can do this. I think a boycott of such magnitude can work in Africa. It's going to be hard here in the United States for Black people here to effectively boycott. There have been successful boycotts in the United States, right? The Montgomery boycott that happened years ago really crippled the busing system in this country to bring a change. But it is almost hard for that to occur because Black people in the United States have to live in a system where the boycott also hurts them, right? But in Africa, you can successfully do this because there are other African companies and products which you can live on that have nothing to do with the West. So you can essentially survive on a boycott. When you boycott a lot of these companies and products in your countries, you can essentially have a successful boycott. It'll only come down to, are you willing to do that? Are you willing to take those steps? Because that is essentially the type of step that you will need to take. Hurt the money, right? Hurt the pockets, hurt the commerce of these companies and corporations in your countries, leeching off your products and resources under the guise of the AFRICOM program, because the AFRICOM program is actually there to protect your interests. So when you hurt the pockets, you essentially free your countries from all these military bases. Because looking at your leaders to do it isn't going to help. Your leaders ain't going to do it. They're taking the money and they're selling your countries. And that is what I believe the West is mostly afraid of, that Africans do not get to a point where they begin to take these types of actions proposed on this platform, because that is essentially what can threaten the presence of AFRICOM. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Like the video, share the content, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all next time.
Det finns ingen annan där som kan stå här by my side, oh why. Sättet du rör på det får mig att dö för dig baby. För de här yardis, de vill ju bara dra ner oss. Men du är fett och vanlig. Och det jag lägger all min tid och jag vill ha dig. Du får mig känna safety. Det kan nog leda baby. Och jag kommer aldrig ändra mig.